Thank you, everyone. Good morning to those on the East Coast and the US, and good afternoon, good evening to those joining us from Palestine. And welcome to our second day final panel of the Richmonders for Peace in Israel-Palestine, the Shireen Abu Akleh, A New Path to Peace. We welcome all of the attendees and all of our panelists. Our topic of discussion today will be the road to one state and how do we get from here to there. It is with the hope of coming out with this conference with a plan of action, how to move this idea forward and how it should be implemented. We are honored to have such as scholars and dedicated activists with us. And our moderator for today's panel will be one of our members from Richmonders for Peace in Israel-Palestine, also an organizing committee member that's been working on putting this conference together very hard for a long, long time. She is also a professor at John Tyler Community College. And amongst us, she does not need an introduction. Without any further ado, Jennifer Hitchcock, take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Adib. My name is Jennifer Hitchcock, and I wanted to say a couple logistical things first before we get started. As Adib said, this panel is going to be, is the road to one state, how do we get there? We had some other panels yesterday. First one was why the two-state solution is dead. And we had another panel, what would a one state look like and how would it function? Our three panelists today are gonna be Ilan Pappé, Dana Al-Kurd, and Miko Peled. I wanted to explain a little bit about how we're gonna have each panelist present for about 15 to 20 minutes. I'm gonna introduce each one, and then after all three panelists have done their presentations, then we're gonna reserve some time for Q&A. So if anyone out there has questions, you can go ahead and put them into the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many of these questions as we can. Also, we had some issues with transcriptions and closed captioning last time, so do notice if you'd like the live transcript, you can click live transcript in your Zoom controls, and you should be able to see this. We're also recording the session, and we'll be posting the videos sometime later, so if you're registered, you'll get a notice about that. Okay, so why don't we go ahead and get started then. So, first of all, our first presenter today is going to be Professor Ilan Pappé, who is the director of the European Center for Palestine Studies at the University of Exeter. He's the author of 20 books, including The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine and On Palestine with Noam Chomsky. He's also a member of the One Democratic State initiative seeking to disseminate the discussion on the one-state solution. So let's go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Pappé. Welcome, Dr. Pappé.
Hello, hello. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a great honor to be together with Dana and hopefully also with Miko. I'm not sure he's with us, so Dana is good enough for me if it's only the two of us. Thank you for organizing this very important conference. I feel you have really left Dana and myself and Miko the most difficult task of all. Imagining the one state is one thing, how to get there is really something totally different. And the natural inclination is actually to say, if I would have known how to do that, I would not have hidden the truth from you, and I've already been doing it. So obviously we're talking about a challenge that we are all finding very difficult to deal with, but one that needless to say, we have to work on together and jointly, because it is a huge effort. I hope not to repeat too many things that were said in the previous panels, because they really covered extensively some of the issues. And I'm sure that Dana and Miko will also add a few things that I'm missing in my presentation. I would like to begin by saying that I would like to distinguish between the question of how do we get there and who gets us there, so to speak. So let's clarify, although I'm sure for this particular panel and for the conference as a whole, and hopefully for many of those who listen and view us today, it is clear, but nonetheless should be stated, that the movement towards a one-state solution has to be led by the Palestinians. That is the best antidote for years and years of so-called peace proposals or peace initiatives or diplomatic efforts that were always forged in Israel and led by the Americans or the Israelis. And of course, this whole concept of who leads the way has to go back to the basic ideas of the Palestinian liberation movement back in the 1960s, where it was very clear that an anti-colonialist movement has to be led by the indigenous, native, colonized, and oppressed population. It is particularly important, I think, to remember the question of who when we discuss the endgame, namely how the one state would look like. And I think in this respect, we had very good and interesting things yesterday. But there are, of course, partners that are in discussion about the endgame as well, in a discussion that has to be led by the Palestinian national movement, whoever belongs to it and whoever represents it or is part of it. It's easy to define the partners for such a discussion outside of Palestine, especially in the world at large or in the West. And it is a bit more difficult to define exactly inside Israel, not so much who are the partners for this discussion, but what is the mode of partnership, so to speak. And we have, and I won't make a distinction that is too profound at this moment, we have ideas such as co-resistance, which are very much inspired by the role of white people in the ANC, kind of the ANC model, or a softer version of that partnership, which is a particular kind of solidarity shown from within the colonizers' society, but not falling into the pitfall of what Albert Memmi used to call the leftist colonizers. Namely, you cannot really work on this with people who still subscribe to Zionist ideology or define themselves as Zionists. I think that when it comes to the question of how we get there, not who gets us there, this could be very much be much more expanded discussion between various people, whether they are Palestinians, people abroad who are part of the solidarity movement, or people inside the Jewish society in Israel who believe in a one-state solution and want to contribute to its realization. It is a good, maybe I can give two opposing examples of how a Palestinian realization or imagination or clear imagination of the end game, that is the nature of the one state, how it looks like, how does it affect people like me or ability of people like myself to contribute to the discussion of how to get there. I'll give two opposing examples. One example that shows where it's very difficult to contribute in any significant way, and one in which it's very important, very easy already to start providing good ideas into the question of how to get to the one-state solution. It is not for me to tell the Palestinians how to envisage the place of the Jews as a community in the future state. But I can urge the Palestinian to tell us, better sooner than later, how they envisage the position of what would be by now a third generation of Jewish settlers in a post-apartheid or post-colonial liberated Palestine. Once this imaged idea of Jewish life within that liberated space is clarified, it's easier for people like myself to work more precisely, more effectively within the Israeli Jewish society in helping to propagate the idea abroad. I will say something that I will repeat later on. This does not mean, to me at least, and maybe some people would disagree with me, I don't think that the success of liberation depends on a huge Jewish support from inside Israel to the project. I just think it's better if the support is larger than smaller, and you get a larger support when there is a clear vision that you want people to persuade is one that should is the one that is realistic, should benefit them as well, or is the one that they will have to accept, even if they don't. It means, of course, losing a lot of the privileges that they have, and really requiring quite a transformation of their racist and exclusive ideas about the reality. So that's an example where I feel that supporting the whole initiative of the one state on the question of how to get there is a bit problematic before there is a kind of a clearer image there. And maybe there is one, and I'm missing it. That's also possible. The opposite example where I also feel it, and when I say I usually mean here myself and quite a few number of colleagues within the Jewish Israeli society who are part of such an initiative. That's the opposite example. There is a very clear Palestinian image of the right of return. Not only that it is an organic part of any solution for the one state, that it's an organic part of a one state solution, that it is precondition for any solution. This is hammered in very clearly, very accurately in many ways. And for example, with few friends, we worked on what the United Nations calls the Pionero principle that were suggested by the United Nations in 2005 about repatriation of refugees, which really fit very well the anyone who wants to imagine, even in practical terms, the right of return being implemented within a liberated Palestine. You feel both as an academic, as an activist, that you can provide people with a much thicker imagined vision of return beyond, of course, the soundbite of return, or without, of course, dealing in any way with the sacredness of that demand, but really turning it into a reality you could relate to, which I think is very important in the way that we all rightly criticize the two-state solution of not providing any means for a realistic implementation of the right of return. And we have this clear notion that the one-state solution goes hand in hand with the implementation of the right of return. There is also another distinction I would like to make, which is between what can be done on the ground in historical Palestine and what can be done abroad. As was mentioned, I'm part of an initiative called the One Democratic State campaign. We are a handful at this point of activists, Palestinians and Israeli Jews, trying to disseminate as wide as possible the discussion on the one state. And we have to admit, the most difficult questions we always have to answer is how do we get there? We hear a lot of sympathetic reaction to the idea itself, but then comes the question, how do we get there? So we find this discussion today, or any such discussion, very helpful. We learned that people, in fact, will not, or put it differently, but the same idea, in many ways, that's my impression. It's not a research, it's my intuitive impression, that people will not engage with you seriously on the question of the one state if you don't tell them something about the end game of that process, not just how you get there, but they would like you, even if you are a bit hesitant, to tell you, yes, but tell me how it would look like. And then I come to my first point. I would like the Palestinian to tell me how would they like to imagine the one state. And yet there is a demand, including from our Palestinian interlocutor, to tell us, if we want our serious response, tell us how does it look like. So our Palestinian friends and us, we prepared, for those of you who would visit the website of the One Democratic State campaign, we prepared a 10-point program. In many ways, these are 10 focal points of discussion rather than carved in stone principle for a one state. And it's easier, I think, to engage with them because they're prefaced with a preamble that defines Zionism as settler colonialism, Israel as an apartheid state, and calls for the decolonization of the whole of historical Palestine, and of course for the implementation of the right of return. So in this respect, the points are open to debate. And I think, and I hope at least, I think they can help to encourage a Palestinian discussion, which I mentioned before, on the collective identity of the Jews in the future model, as one example. Somewhere between a harsh version of binational state to an Arab state with a Jewish cultural minority, not in demography, not minority necessarily in terms of demography, but as a collective identity among other collective identities that would be recognized and protected by the future state. Very much ideas you hear in the Arab world today about the failure of European-made nation state to respect group identities all over the Mashriq. A model that the Ottoman Empire at least knew how to respect, and somewhere was forgotten with the imposition of nation state by the colonialist empires in Sykes-Picot and after. The various electorates, for better terms, we engage with define the nature of our efforts. We know what we would like to do with the Jewish community, to deprogram them in a way, teach them about decolonization and the real nature of Zionism, special effort about engaging with Arab Jews, and yet feeling all the time that such a change in a Jewish mindset inside Israel is not, I repeat, is not a precondition for the liberation of Palestine. Not an easy dialogue to have with people if you tell them that, but a necessary one. More intriguing questions come in the discussion with people in the West Bank who are interested in our dialogue about the one state and how we get there. You can imagine that one of the major topics we are dealing with is Israeli Jewish settlements in the West Bank, because somehow the two states model has a practical response to the Jewish settlements inside the West Bank, total dismantlement and eviction of the Jewish settlers. But if you talk about it within the one state solution, you have to analyze the difference, if there is a difference, between the Jewish settlements that were built until 1967 inside Israel and the Jewish settlements that were built in the West Bank after 1967. I'm not going to give a solution to the problem. I'm just putting it as something that comes out in the questions, and more work has to be done there. The most enthusiastic support, with much less questions about how we get there, maybe because they know how to get there, comes from Gaza. Again, this is not a research. This is totally my intuitive impression, but I think it's quite well based. Similar, of course, responses we get from refugee communities within refugee camps. the exilic communities is a bit more diverse, I think, on this issue. What comes from the refugee camps is also comments, very important comments to us, that we should pay attention to the question of representation, or if you want, representation, and institutional or rebuilding of institutional representation within the Palestinian liberation movement as part of a healing process of the destruction caused by the 1982 destruction of the PLO and the Oslo processes, and to note that such processes have to mature before a more serious discussion can be had about how we get there. You need that issue to be developed in many ways. Finally, abroad, as you all know, and that's why we have this webinar, I think, it's much easier to disseminate what Shireen Hussein used to call in her book the community of the discourse of the one state, because these are not, apart from Palestinians who live there, the other people who are involved in it are not stakeholders in the sense that they would live there or not live there. So it is moving between a utopian or a sense of utopian discussion on the one hand, but on the other hand, and that's very paradoxical, it helps for a very concrete activism in many ways, because the BDS is very closely connected to the ODS, to the one democratic state. It's very difficult to find anyone who supports the BDS who supports still a two-state solution. And I think that means that this is not just an abstract idea of a better solution. It is something that can be unpacked, because you know exactly, as part of a solidarity movement abroad, what you want to tell people in order to expand the solidarity and to do the most important thing, which the solidarity movement has failed until today, which is to persuade the political elites, the mainstream media, to adopt the same moral positions, at least if not the full political position, towards the issue of the one state from above and not just from below. Finally, I think that to end on a positive note, I think there is one development that it's not the most crucial part of how to get there, but it is a necessary part of how to get there. And I draw a lot of optimism, because this is a very successful story. And in a minute, I will do it in 2 minutes and I will finish. This is a very successful story that should, I think, inspire us. We succeeded in many parts of the West to include Palestine studies as a legitimate academic area of inquiry. Now, I know for many people, any development within the ivory towers of academia looks irrelevant to realities on the ground, and 95% of the time you're right if you have this skeptical approach on academia. However, I think this is relevant. You cannot have Palestine studies without infusing activism with professionalism. There's no point of having Palestine studies if you don't believe in the one-state solution. And there's no point of having Palestine studies, and we have already in the West 8 programs of postgraduate studies on Palestine studies, if you are not seeing your academic career closely connected to helping political elite, movement on the ground, to exactly answer the question that was put on this panel. And the fact that this is growing by the day, I counted, not totally accurately, but I think today there are 105, at this given moment, there are 105 PhDs being written, not already completed, being written on Palestine. And so many of them deal academically and professionally on the questions of how to get there. And this would be a very useful material once other issues are supported. And finally, what is so refreshing about this is the total change of the vocabulary, the one that our political elites and mainstream media refuses to use. Nobody is talking about the conflict. People are talking about an anti-colonial struggle, and they're taking away the study of Palestine from conflict studies into decolonization, genocide studies, and so on. Nobody is talking about the peace process. People talk about decolonization. People don't use the word solution. They talk about change of regime, for instance. This accurate language is the best antidote to the main weapon that Israel is using against such discussion, namely weaponizing anti-Semitism. It forces the whole debate about Palestine to be centered about the history of racism, the present situation of racism, a new genealogy of the term, and a new understanding that there's no hierarchy of racism. There's not one which is more important than the others, and a clearer definition of the regimes that are racist and the people who suffer from this racism is already illuminated in very clear colors, in HD actually, in so many parts of the academia. I don't think we did enough accumulation of that to understand. Again, I don't want to overstate its importance. I'm just saying that there is some trends here in human understanding and perception of Palestine that include a lot of professional knowledge that is standing there waiting to be asked, to be used in order to give more meat, and the vegetarian among you would excuse me, to put more meat on the bones of this wonderful dish, which would be called the liberation of Palestine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pappé. Next, we're going to hear from Dana El-Kurd. And Dana El-Kurd is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science, excuse me, at the University of Richmond. She's also the author of Polarized and Demobilized: Legacies of Authoritarianism in Palestine. That's published in Oxford University Press in 2020. El-Kurd is also a senior non-residential fellow at the Arab Center in Washington and a fellow at the Middle East Institute. She's going to be discussing the importance of centering Palestinian sovereignty in discussions of the one-state solution. So I want to go ahead and turn it over to Professor Dana El-Kurd. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen here. I have a few slides. Sorry, the poli-sci person in me has to have slides. So I'm just getting it all set up. Okay, everybody can see that, right?
Yes.
Awesome. All right. So as was mentioned, today I'll be talking about recentering Palestinian sovereignty and national rights in our discussions. And my main argument is that proposed, quote unquote, solutions to the Palestinian struggle against Israel have de-emphasized Palestinian sovereignty and national rights. This is obviously the case in solutions that are proposed from the right wing, but also I think solutions posed from the left can have these kind of shortcomings. And it's decoupled the concept of national rights from the concept of sovereignty. And so my argument is that a practical as well as just solution or endgame will be impossible to achieve without reasserting the centrality of these rights, like putting Palestinian sovereignty at the crux of our discussions. From that, more generative discussions can flow. So I don't, just like Dr. Pappé mentioned, I don't claim to have an answer necessarily on every point. I have ideas. Maybe we can discuss those in the Q&A as well. But that's really kind of my main contribution, is that this should be the center of our discussion. So let me just give some definitions as to what I mean by both Palestinian national rights as well as Palestinian sovereignty. This is more than the idea of collective rights within a settler colonial state. So there's some advocates, things like the Carnegie report on apartheid in Israel, the Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, all the ones that made a big splash. Excuse me. They are talking about extending liberal rights so that Palestinians have a right to speak their language, have a right to representation, all of those things. And even those that come close to talking about kind of like the national identity of Palestinians, they're talking about them from within a framework of getting this Israeli state to concede some of these rights, and hopefully in the future that this becomes a cumulative, large-scale change. Even Palestinian voices have advocated for something like this. So Ghada Karmi has written things about this. Sarin Sebe in 2012, very controversially talked about not even extending full citizenship to Palestinians, just doing it very piecemeal, second-class citizenship, no voting rights, but the ability to remain. So this is what I'm talking about when I say Palestinian national rights, it's beyond that. It's beyond just the extension of liberal rights within the state. And I think as mentioned in the One Democratic State manifesto as well, is that the Palestinian national rights and the idea of the Palestinian identity is tied to a broader regional identity and nation. That Palestinians are Arabs, that not only are there refugee communities now, Palestinian refugee communities across a number of different states, but that there are linkages and ties between Palestinians and other Arab communities. And we have to kind of account for that in our understanding of Palestinian national rights. And I'll talk about what I mean by that in a second. And the way that Arab scholars define nation is based on this premise of basically it's a people who possess a desire for sovereignty. So like Palestinian scholar Azmi Bishara connects the two very clearly. And I think that this is sometimes missing from analysis, let's say in the West. Now, in terms of conceptions of sovereignty and what I mean by sovereignty, I don't want to like get into all the academic like lingo and jargon and all of that, but I'll try to make this as clear as possible on my end. We often think of this sovereignty as belonging to a state, right? But that's kind of how we understand it in layman's terms. That's kind of how the international system understands it. But there are lots of discussions within political science and within kind of social sciences generally that sovereignty should not be thought of as just the ability of a state actor to impose its will on a territory or rebuff external intervention, but it's also the ability of a people that consider themselves owners of that land or citizens of that state to exercise control over the territory and to have a say in its future. So we don't want to think about sovereignty as just this kind of political legal concept or an institution of international relations. It should be tied to the legitimacy of that state and the people themselves who are sovereign. And I'm I don't know who follows me on the internet. I'm very online, unfortunately, kind of addicted, but I've been recently like very heavily attacked for mentioning the idea of restoring Palestinian sovereignty. So people who think they're very clever, they get online and they think, when have Palestinians ever had sovereignty? They've never had a state. But that's why this conception of sovereignty is what we need to impose. Even societies, communities, and nations, indigenous communities and nations that have never had a state can be thought of as sovereign. And we have lots of evidence for that, not only because we need to talk about sovereignty in this way, but also because in the book World Making After Empire by Autumn Gadachew, she speaks about how indigenous people did have sovereignty and that even colonizers recognized that. That's why they made these legal arrangements with them, even if it was just to deprive them of liberty and land. But like, it's an understood concept that even indigenous people who've never had a state in the modern understanding of the term, they still have sovereignty, and that sovereignty belongs to that people even in the absence of a state. So as I said, we have to kind of move away from the traditional sense of sovereignty and emphasize instead domestic sovereignty and interdependent sovereignty. So people, even in the absence of a state, can claim sovereignty. They can legitimize those claims by either, discussing their historical legacy in the land, continuity in the territory, their indigeneity. And so what we think about what sovereignty needs to look like needs to account for this population that has the ability to exercise domestic sovereignty, which means exercising effective control within the borders of their own state, as well as interdependent sovereignty, meaning the ability of people to regulate the flow of information, ideas, goods, and people across the borders of the state. So this is what I mean when I say Palestinian sovereignty and what it needs to look like. And as I'll demonstrate in the coming slides, and I'm sorry that I haven't attended the other panels, just I've had personal issues come up, but if I repeat myself, I do apologize. But essentially my argument is that there's no political program thus far around the quote unquote Israeli-Palestinian conflict that's put forward something that emphasizes the centrality of these rights adequately. So just very briefly to talk about the proposed solutions on the right, I don't think I need to convince anybody in this group about that, but right-wing forces, those who want Israel to control the entirety of historic Palestine have culminated in the likes of Donald Trump or Jared Kushner, but their vision for ending the conflict has been, kind of percolating for some time. And essentially this kind of right-wing approach to Palestinian statehood and sovereignty is basically to deny them altogether. Instead, advocate for kind of the highly controlled self-governance in severely surveilled pockets of territory, and puts forward a solution that basically fulfills none of the previously mentioned conditions of sovereignty. So it's a vision of a state in name only, where sovereignty is approximated with limited self-governance. And in fact, the Kushner plan, the Peace to Prosperity plan, explicitly mentions this. They talk about how we need to rethink sovereignty because it is an quote unquote an obstacle or a stumbling block and distracting from more pragmatic and operational concerns. So it's not like they very clearly take sovereignty off the table. They want mere subsistence for the Palestinian people. But even though, you know, I'm not claiming that any of the solutions posed from like advocates or people on the left are as, you know, this egregious, I think that they still sometimes fall into some of the same pitfalls. So solutions from the left, whether it's the right-based approach or even the ones that talk about regime change, they have understandably and obviously been more concerned with Palestinian living conditions. And so we see, you know, as I mentioned at the beginning, all of those reports about how Israel is an apartheid state and calling for Israel to respect the rights of the Palestinians and things like that. And it comes, you know, after a lot of organizing on the front of, you know, the Palestinian civil society with the BDS movement as well. But essentially, and I'm sorry, just to make one last point on this, is that these right-based approaches are not necessarily incompatible with what I'm saying, but so far they haven't provided kind of structural solutions to the idea of colonization, because basically they don't address those legacies, is my point. So for that reason, I think some Palestinian activists and scholars push back against even this idea of binationalism, and it's becoming quite unpopular, especially with young people. So they argue that binational solutions in which Palestinians are, as I mentioned earlier, kind of extended citizenship, fall into the liberal notion of rights and assume that these lack of rights that are currently extended to Palestinians is just a deficiency rather than a feature of a settler colonial state. So there's this fear amongst some Palestinian activists and scholars that the binational solution will be reduced to basically upholding individual rights and maybe making lip service to collective or national rights, but not really changing power dynamics and not saying much about Palestinian sovereignty. And then there's also the post-colonial solution. I don't know how many people have read Mahmoud Mamdani's recent book, Neither Settler Nor Native. I think that that's a pretty good articulation of what the post-colonial solution looks like. So basically this is arguing, Mamdani argues for a single democratic state without nations, like basically a denationalized solution. And his argument is that both settlers and the colonized are victims of modernity. They're victims of the nation state system. And to remove the existential threat that occurs between them, you know, kind of because they want primacy over the land, you have to build a system that rejects the identities of the permanent majority and minority. And he uses the South Africa example as his kind of main example. But there's, I think, a lot wrong with this solution as well. Kind of the de-emphasis of national identities is, I think, problematic as well, especially on the side of the Palestinians, because just the equation of like settlers and colonizers is quite problematic, because basically these kind of post-colonial frameworks, as Ella Shahat writes, say that there's, quote, no clear domination. And so there's not really a call for any clear opposition. And you can see why this can be so dangerous in a situation where one group, the Palestinians, faces an existential threat. They still face an existential threat. The second problem with this solution is that it de-emphasizes the Palestinian connection to the rest of the region. It doesn't really account for it at all. So how Palestine is understood as an Arab issue and how Palestinians see themselves. And then it dismisses these national aspirations and the reality of public opinion of both groups. So not only do we know that like Israelis are ever more fearful of like the demographic threat of Palestinians, and they're increasingly trading in their democratic institutions for the sake of preserving their dominance. But on the other side, Palestinians, they want a state that represents them. They want a state that has a national identity at its core. And that's why we see actually a low level of support for the one-state solution in all of the polling that has existed from a number of different institutions. And we also saw that play out in the Unity Intifada last year, where Palestinians living under all forms of Israeli rule, whether they carried citizenship or not, they basically rejected traditional politics and this kind of artificial fragmentation. Instead, they insisted on asserting their shared national identity. And literally lots of the campaigns were talking about raising a national consciousness and things like that. So the post-colonial solution doesn't really hold up to the reality of what people actually want. And finally, just the last point is that the post-colonial solution holds up poor models. The South Africa model, which is seen as kind of like the pinnacle for in Mamdani's book and the Rainbow Nation, has been, for all intents and purposes, a failure in that front, because inequality is more exacerbated than ever. As outlined in the book, Black and White Rainbow by Carolyn Holmes, a political scientist, 72% of individually held rural land remains in white hands. And at no stage since 1994 has the budget for land reform exceeded 2% of the national budget. So there's no comprehensive plan for reparations, no comprehensive plan for land acquisition, and no appetite for supporting those, who want their land back. So this is not really a way, this whole kind of solution is not really a way to rectify the systems that are in place because of settler colonialism. And essentially it kind of creates a situation where you cement realities and you continue to exacerbate inequalities in the future. And understandably, this is not at all popular with Palestinians. Now, what is kind of being talked about more, at least amongst Palestinian youth activists, is this decolonization framework. And this is really the only framework, and it emerged from kind of settler colonial studies and Palestine studies. It's the only framework that emphasizes indigeneity and emphasizes sovereignty and control of the land for Palestinians. And many such advocates reject binationalism because they see it as a way to accept the settlers' claim to the land in some way. Some of them see it as assimilation by another name. Some would even go so far as to say like it's genocidal to the Palestinian national claim. And it identifies the problems of Israel's settler colonial nature very clearly. It's very good at identification. But I think it does leave some unanswered questions. What decolonization actually entails hasn't been fully worked out. And I think a lot of even the scholarship on this doesn't really work it out. So they see, first of all, they see Israel as a state that pursues an inherent logic of domination because of its settler colonial nature. And this is absolutely a valid starting point, but it does little to explain how identities might shift and whether, human agency plays any role in transforming these identities. We know that settler colonialism is not static. We know that it's not just a single point in time. It's not just the Nakba, but does that also mean it has to be unidirectional? Like, can we, for example, envision a different point to the Israeli nation that doesn't, as settler colonial studies scholar Lorenzo Veracini says, end in total annihilation or total victory? Because that's quite a dangerous kind of proposition. It's the existential nature of this conflict makes it quite dangerous. So we can, for example, think about the growing trend of Mizrahi activists who are reimagining their identities, their future relationships to the region. We can also use kind of the nonlinear history of Jewish migration and Jewish thought to demonstrate that Zionism doesn't have to be unidirectional and the settler colonial state doesn't have to be unidirectional. So I have some examples of that if people have questions on that. But secondly, people who rely on this kind of decolonization framework will often make comparisons between Israel and other settler colonial states. So they'll talk about South Africa, sometimes Algeria is mentioned, or the United States. But I think that these comparisons can sometimes obfuscate specificities because as I think was alluded to in Dr. Pappé's talk earlier, is that this is now a settler society that has lived there for generations and does not, unlike other settler societies that have existed in the past, does not have, a single motherland kind of to return to. And the examples of decolonization in other places, like in Algeria, where the settler society was expelled, it's often presented in a historically inaccurate way. People assume that this was by design when actually it was by mistake. And so we can't have discussions of decolonization that want us to replicate what happened in these other cases. It's not a congruent situation at all. And so essentially the reality in this situation is that a nation has been formed in Israel, identities have solidified, right? It's difficult to separate the Israeli identity from Zionism. What is an Israeli without Zionism? I'm not an expert, but that's an open question. So it's the decolonization framework is quite hazy on how do you reject the two-state solution, you reject binationalism, but what do you do with this settler society? And that doesn't, require demands for self-deportation, which are unrealistic, or reflect the realities of the power dynamic on the ground. Because at the end of the day, one side has all the, most of the power, the material power. One side has most of the capacity for violence and destruction, and the other side will pay the price for that. So framing decolonization in these kinds of fatalistic terms makes any possible endgame kind of hard to imagine, and makes the issue of Israel-Palestine more existential. And I think we need to think clearly about these terms when we use them. So that's why I'm proposing, whether it's the decolonization framework or those who advocate for binationalism, I don't think that there's necessarily a lot of practical differences there, but basically I argue for thinking differently, putting national rights and sovereignty at the center of the conversation, meaning emphasizing the Palestinian right to control the land, the future of the land, and who flows in and out of the land. So how do we kind of envision a reality beyond this point without equivocating between settlers and colonized, without reducing Palestinian sovereignty claims? For one, we can't obfuscate between the perpetrators and the victims. Starting from that point means that we're going to continue to perpetuate the same kinds of dynamics. But instead, we need to think about, excuse me, I'm losing my voice a little. We need to think about reparations, and I'll talk about that in just a second as well. Secondly, the Palestinian identity can't be minimized in any kind of future state, nor their claims to full sovereignty. So things like the post-national solutions are kind of out of the question. And to avoid the pitfalls of South Africa's kind of binational approach, or quote unquote, its rainbow nation approach, a resolution needs to make sure that the demands and desires of the Palestinians takes precedence over the demands and desires of the settler society. That means, as I said, urging the implementation of reparative approaches, reparations such as land back schemes. It would go beyond those kinds of assimilationist solutions with the mere extension of civil rights and liberties, specify particularly and very specifically the affirmative actions that need to take place to change realities on the ground. So I'm less interested in ideological conversions. I think that could happen over time, but I think it's kind of not silly, but like bad strategy to lead with that. I don't think we could convince Israelis necessarily of like that they have to reject Zionism. My interest is in shifting material power. So we need to do that through reparations, and we need to also reimagine citizenship, not as a form of assimilation or domination as it has served up to this point, as we can see within the Palestinian communities within Israel that have citizenship. What we need is a citizenship that basically doesn't ignore the regional histories of the fact that Palestinians cross state borders and that they have ties to the larger Arab nation. So we need to basically reimagine how Palestinians might move across state borders, hold non-traditional citizenship status, even those who maybe have become refugees but don't want to return. All of that is all of these things are other aspects to consider. And to respect Palestinian sovereignty in this way, kind of delinked from the defined borders of a single state, would be also necessary to facilitate the right of return. And I think that right of return should take precedence over Jewish migration. I think that needs to be how we shift the power dynamic. Palestinian sovereignty should be at the hierarchy of priorities, at the top of the hierarchy of priorities. So as I said at the beginning, I don't claim to have all the answers. I do have some ideas, but I only want to note that when we start with Palestinian sovereignty as like our main goal, that's where we can allow space for these kind of radical solutions. And really nothing less would rebalance the inequalities of power and resources between the two communities and achieve a just peace. So I know it seems maybe a little bit fantastical, but I think our starting point can make space for these kind of larger imaginations. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dana El-Kurd. And now our final panelist that's going to present is Miko Peled. Miko is a writer and human rights activist born and raised in Jerusalem. He's been a clear voice calling for justice in Palestine, support of the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, sanctions, and the creation of a single democracy with equal rights on all of historic Palestine. He's also written 2 books about Israel and Palestine, The General's Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine, and Injustice, the story of the Holy Land Foundation 5. Peled is also a contributor to Mint Press News and authors a blog at mikopeled.com and a podcast at patreon.com/mikopeled.com. Miko's view is that all of Palestine is in fact already a single state, an apartheid state, and then we must fight to transform it to a free democratic Palestine. So now I want to turn it over to Miko. Go ahead, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be with you. I also have to apologize. I missed the previous speakers. I did hear Dana's great presentation. So I want to start by reminding whoever's listening, and if anybody hasn't noticed, all of Palestine is already a single state. So the conversation one state, two state is really not one that's relevant to moving forward. In fact, the conversation about two state is an effort to keep things moving back because it legitimizes Zionism and it legitimizes the state of Israel. That's its entire purpose. So Palestine is a single state from the river to the sea, from north to south. It's the apartheid state of Israel. And again, if anybody hasn't been paying attention, there is a report by Amnesty International which makes it very, very clear that Israel has been engaged in a crime against humanity since it was established, and that crime is the crime of apartheid, which, like I said, is designated as a crime against humanity. So that's where we are. I believe our struggle, and when I say us, I mean people of conscience around the world. I think our struggle needs to focus on transforming the current apartheid state of Israel, which has taken over all of historic Palestine, to a free Palestine. And I think in the view of many people, that is it. Once we have a free Palestine, a free democratic Palestine, then that's it. You know, we've arrived. I believe the reality is that once we've achieved a single democratic Palestine over all of historic Palestine, that's just the first step. This is the basis. This is the foundation from which we build everything else. Nothing is going to change until we get to that point. People talk about ending the occupation. People talk about lifting the siege on Gaza. People talk about and focus on the right of return, on the prisoners. These are all issues, water rights and on and on. These are all issues that exist within this large framework of the apartheid regime. None of these issues are going to be resolved until Palestinians have a voice, a political voice within Palestine. None of this is going to change until we have a free democratic Palestine in place in historic Palestine. So I think we, you know, quite often people like to put the cart in front of the horse. How we get to that point, I can just touch on that, briefly, how I see it happening. But I think it's really important to understand that is step one. Nothing is going to change as long as we have the state of Israel as it is today, controlling all of Palestine. And another thing I want to make sure we understand, or the way I understand it, is that when people talk about the occupation, people say end the occupation. It's a slogan, it's a bumper sticker. Well, which occupation? The occupation of 1948 or the occupation of 1967, or both? The focus on Israel's occupation of the 1967 only, I think in most cases, exists in order to legitimize the occupation of 1948. So in 1948, the vast majority, the larger portion, the lion's share of Palestine was taken. 1967, they finished the job, literally finished the job. When you look at how the generals used to speak, how Israeli politicians spoke throughout the 50s and early 60s, it was obvious that it was just a matter of time to take the rest of, to move the way they described it, the eastern boundary of the state of Israel to the Jordan River where it belongs. So I think we need to make that clear. There is no part of Palestine that is not occupied. It's all occupied. And if we're talking about ending the occupation, we need to discuss ending the occupation of all of Palestine. And again, that is step one. Once we have a real free democratic state, a Palestinian state, the state of Palestine, on historic Palestine, we can move on. Now, I think the comparison to South Africa is good in some ways and is not good in some ways. I mean, the differences are enormous. In South Africa, we had 40 million Black Africans who never went to school, who never had the opportunity to study. That doesn't exist in Palestine. Objectively speaking, if we take out the obstacles, there could be a productive, democratic, free Palestine that is functioning, tomorrow. Not literally tomorrow, but the next day once it's established, because we have two societies that are highly educated and understand how to operate and have traditions of democracy and so on. So that is, I think that's an important distinction, and I think therefore the chances for success in a free Palestine are far greater, and the chances for success of dealing with the other issues, not just the freedom of Palestine and the transformation from apartheid to democracy, but all the other issues of reparations and rights and righting the wrong, if you will, the wrongs that have taken place, are the chances for success are far greater than they ever were in South Africa. Now, once we do have that free democratic Palestine, and I believe the way to get there, of course, is through pursuing the demands for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, through demanding isolation, political, diplomatic isolation of the state of Israel. I think where people of conscience, people who stand on the side of justice and freedom, need to do a lot more, particularly in the United States, is to work with the elected officials to make sure that elected officials understand what Zionism is, that associating with Zionism is completely unacceptable. That Zionism, anti-Semitism, white supremacy are all belong in the same column. And it is unacceptable to be associated with any of those. And if anybody, again, has any doubt what Zionism is, and people like to, argue there's this kind of Zionism, there's that kind of Zionism, there's only one Zionism. It's a racist, violent ideology that established a brutal apartheid state. Now, some may be a little more liberal, some may be a little more conservative, some may be a little more religious, but that is not relevant to our issue. In terms of Palestine, there's one Zionism, and it's like I said, it's racist, it's violent, and it cannot be tolerated and must be rejected completely. The second thing is we need to understand or remember, if we have, for those of us who haven't necessarily been paying attention, the Zionist PR machine has been in place for over 100 years. In the United States, in the UK, in other parts of Europe, around the world, they have been vigilant. They've been working hard every single day, every single moment to push their agenda forward for over 100 years. I have this poster at home that advertises a lecture my grandfather gave in 1920 in Kiev about Zionism and the land of Israel and the state of the Jewish people and so on. So, I mean, they've been at this, and he was part of this diplomatic corps that the Zionists had of, well-spoken, good-looking, very white, non-Jewish looking, highly educated people who were around the world promoting the idea of Zionism. And they were very successful. The Zionists learned very early on again, particularly here in the United States, that all politics is local. So when people talk about the lobby, the Zionist lobby, the pro-Israel lobby, the image is usually a bunch of people with suits in Washington, D.C. The lion's share of the lobby, the lion's share of the work, the PR work that the Zionists do, is in local communities, in school boards, in city council meetings, mayoral elections. We all know about the police force and police chiefs who are brought over. And I'm talking about even the smallest of cities. They are there, they're doing their work, they're promoting their agenda, they're making sure that in the public school textbooks, the terminology is the one that they prescribe. They make sure that every elected official, and again, going all the way down to school board, are on their side. They make sure that wealthy Zionist Jews are, the philanthropy that comes with or from wealthy Zionist Jews across the country there's always a Zionist element embedded in there. There was always some kind of recognition of Israel embedded within their work. And that's why they're so successful. So when somebody runs for office, for national office, they've already been indoctrinated. They don't need to be convinced that, the Zionist perspective is the right perspective. And I think in many cases, elected officials don't really care that much about Israel-Palestine. They have their own agenda, and if this is what gets them elected, then that's the way they're going to go. We need to break that pattern. We need to be in there. We need to make sure that our elected officials understand if they associate with Zionism, if they're willing to work with Zionists, if they are in any shape or form legitimize Zionism, then that is completely unacceptable and they will be rejected and they will not receive our vote. That, I believe, is our toughest challenge because, again, the Zionists have been at this for over 100 years. We're really just getting started trying to figure out, find our hands and legs in this issue, how to defeat this PR war. And even now, after this gruesome images of the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh and the assault on her funeral procession, things that are just unheard of, they're there, they're talking, they're explaining. They just announced that there won't be an inquiry, there won't be an investigation into the murder because the local commander found that there's no evidence of wrongdoing. And life goes on. In other words, they move on with their life. Their ambassadors, their spokespeople are out there spewing their lies, spewing their racist, violent agenda. And everybody around the world just kind of accepts this and listens to it. And I think that's because they don't feel the pressure from us to reject the Zionist spokespeople, to reject the Zionist perspective. Now, I mentioned earlier, talking a little bit about this, putting the cart in front of the horse. If I was to envision how things progress from where we are today to the moment where we have a free democratic Palestine, in this case, I think the South African model is helpful. I think that once the people on our side, people of conscience, again, get our act together in a way, we can come to a point where severe sanctions are imposed on the state of Israel, where Israeli athletes cannot compete in any sporting events, where Israeli cultural figures cannot participate in international cultural events, where Israeli academics are barred from academic institutions and academic events. Anybody who represents the state of Israel is barred. We can get to that. We can come to a point where there's an end to, and by the way, a lot of this is mentioned in the Amnesty report as recommendations for the international community. So we can get to that point. And at that point, once we reach a certain tipping point, the apartheid regime in Palestine will be on its knees. We'll have nowhere to go, which is what happened in South Africa in many ways. They had nowhere to go. There was nothing to do. It was over. That was it. And they came to that realization. And then de Klerk stood up in front of a podium and he said three things. We're going to release the prisoners, including Nelson Mandela. We're going to unban the banned political parties. and we're calling for a one person, one vote election throughout the country. And that really was the end of apartheid. I mean, certainly there's still a lot of problems, but that is in terms of the structure. So imagine this in Palestine, and then there's a one person, one vote, and then there's a legislative body that represents all the people. And I think it's also important to remember in terms of the numbers, there's all these, there is a Palestinian majority in historic Palestine right now. It's going to grow. And then once the refugees are permitted to return, allowed to return, then it's going to grow ever more. So that is a given. Why people are afraid of it, why people think it's a problem, why people think it's a bad thing, I can't understand really. The Palestinian majority is the reality. So we have a legislative body, then we have an executive that governs the country for the first time, representing all the people who live between the river and the sea. Now, at that point, this governing body, this legislative body, are going to start having to do all the work. That's when the siege of Gaza on Gaza will end. That's when political prisoners will be released. That is when the process of permitting and creating the mechanisms for the refugees to return can start. Now we've got a constitution. There needs to be a constitution. We need to define what a citizen is, who a citizen is. How do we right the wrongs of over 7 decades? By then, hopefully it won't be much more than that by the time this happens, but all the decades in which Palestinians were subjected to this horrific regime. That's when all of this is going to take place. Now, a lot of people do see and kind of describe an equivalency between what Israel claims, or this reality that Israel created and Zionism promotes, which is the right of Jews to come to Palestine. And as though that was equivalent to the Palestinian right of return. I think it's really important to divorce Judaism from Zionism, and then to identify better what Israelism is. So Jews do not have a claim traditionally or a right to Palestine, period. It's not God-given. And if people have any doubts, there are really excellent Jewish sources that show very clearly that this whole claim that God gave Jews the land and all of this is completely untrue. And according to Jewish law, sovereignty in the Holy Land is prohibited anyway. So the Zionists, being secular, and in terms of the way Orthodox Jews view it, are heathens anyway. This, I think, is really, really important to define. There are Jews, and Jews live around the world, and they're citizens of the world, and that has nothing to do with Palestine. The right of Palestinians to return is absolute. The right of Jews to come to Palestine is fake. It was created by the Zionists as part of this PR campaign of theirs to somehow connect Jewish people around the world with the ancient Hebrews, who may or may have not lived at some point in history in Palestine, or occupied a part of Palestine at some point in history. So I think this is going to be very helpful when we start talking about this. And then reparations. You know, the book Palestinian Refugees in International Law came out, I think, a second edition a year or two ago. And it discusses not just the status of the refugees in international law, which is in fact very strong. In other words, their case is a very strong case. Not only has it not been weakened with time, it has strengthened with time, but also what was taken. One of the Zionist myths is that the Jews made the desert bloom, that Palestine for 2,000 years was really a backwater. There was nothing there but some, I don't know, a few camels and Bedouins, and there was nothing there. Which of course, people who know the history and who know Palestine, and there's not enough of people like that, understand that this is absolutely not true. But this document, this book, also describes precisely what was taken. Millions of dollars from the banks, produce from the fields, fruit from the trees. In other words, millions and millions of untold, either in value or in actual cash, was stolen. Tracts of land that were fertile and cultivated. Public spaces, building, cities, not just the individual homes of people, but public spaces that belonged to that were Palestinian. All of this is valued at billions of dollars today. And in fact, they do have a number that is a little outdated, but they, just to give people an idea, just how much money we're talking about. So reparations are a big issue that needs to be discussed. It's not going to be discussed in the current political climate and the current political situation. It's only going to be discussed seriously once we do have a legislative body and an executive in Palestine that represents all the people. And I'm not suggesting it's going to be easy. And I'm not suggesting that the struggle ends by creating this free democratic Palestine, because the struggle for all of these things is going to continue. This is going to be the nature of the state. This is the nature of the reality in Palestine. And, we can't really ignore it. I think it would be silly to ignore that. And I think it's important that the rights of Palestinians, like the right of return, like the right to reparations, like righting, a long list of wrongs that Palestinians have suffered over the decades, needs to be it needs to be rooted in law. It needs to be rooted in a constitution that can only be created, that can only be envisioned once we have this reality of a free democratic Palestine. So the conversation on whether or not or how we get to a single democracy, how we transform this single state, which is an apartheid state, to a free Palestine, I would say needs to focus on how we get elected officials to distance themselves completely from Zionism, how we, I don't know if convince is the word, but how we get elected officials throughout the world, and some officials who are not elected too, to understand that associating with Zionism is not acceptable. Zionism must be rejected completely. All the conversations trying to split hairs on different kinds of Zionism cannot be accepted at all. And then moving towards severe sanctions. Severe sanctions. There should be no money flowing into the state of this apartheid state of Israel. There should be certainly no weapons. There should be no defense trade with the state of Israel. And on, like I said, cultural and athletic sporting events, and on and on and on. That needs to be our focus. That is, I believe, the way we move into the place where apartheid in Palestine will be on its knees, and then we can move forward from there. And then we can get to that moment where we call for elections and unban the political parties and release the political prisoners. And again, once we're at that point, we'll be facing all the other challenges. In terms of Israelis, I think it's another point. I'm an Israeli, and people very often say to me, why do you identify yourself as an Israeli, not as a Palestinian? Since I firmly, support the free Palestine. But the identity of Israelis does not have to be connected to Zionism. Just like Italians didn't have to be associated with fascism, or all white South Africans associated with apartheid. Apartheid fell, white South Africans, became part of this new system. And that is, again, going to be a process. Now, once we have one person, one vote elections, and the country is divided into say, voting districts, which doesn't exist today, then you have a Palestinian and an Israeli who are going to elections who live in the same district. Are they going to vote along the national lines? Are they going to vote for their common interest, which is, low taxes and good roads and good schools? I think the process is part of the solution as well. And just to finish, I will say that I think that the chances of success are greater than anything we've ever seen. The chances to get to the point where the apartheid regime in Palestine collapses and transformed into a real free democratic Palestine exists. We need to understand, and we need to be knowledgeable about the history of Palestine. Like Norma Saha in his book, A 4,000-Year History, talks about, the fact that Palestine has been referred to as Palestine going back almost 4,000 years. So clearly, ending this period of apartheid, it needs to continue to be Palestine. But all of this is going to be possible only if we unite, if we organize better, if we speak out better, if we educate ourselves better, and we create a real front of resistance to Zionism and to any politicians, any elected officials who still think it's okay to associate with Zionism. So basically, you know, I'd like to leave people with a sense of hope, but a responsible hope, hope that relies that with the understanding that we have to bring about the change. We have to do what needs to be done, or else it's not going to happen. And I think Dana mentioned that, you know, this settler colonialism in Palestine is not static. It's moving ahead. The Zionists are destroying Palestine very fast. And the victims are not only the Palestinians who are alive today, but future generations who are not going to be able to see this beautiful country and what it has to offer. So yeah, that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miko. And we appreciate all the panelists' presentations and insights. And now we're going to move into the Q&A portion. We've had some screeners looking at the Q&A questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can. If you haven't put a question in the Q&A that you'd like to ask, you can put it in there now. And again, we'll try to get to as many as we can. We won't be able to get to all of them though. There was a few questions that have come up that all kind of ask more about the role of the BDS movement. I actually completed a dissertation a couple years ago focusing on analyzing the discourse of the BDS movement. And so I think there, you know, as a lot of people think, and y'all have all mentioned this, that there's a lot of things the BDS movement does very well as far as framing the situation and getting some tangible victories. But, you know, I wanted to ask you all, and this can be for any of the panelists who want to answer. There's a couple of things people have brought up regarding the role of BDS. One question regards, you know, what do you all think about, you know, the fact that BDS movement has not endorsed a one-state solution? And, you know, I know there were some reasons for that, but whether you see that as problematic and if that needs to happen. Someone else asked about whether, you know, and I think they were trying to get at the issue of normalization, of that some people in the movement, you know, would rather not have dialogue with Israelis, and how that might potentially be an obstacle. So any of the panelists want to jump in here regarding what you think are, I guess, the role, the benefits, and, you know, some of the drawbacks to the BDS movement internationally at this point. And any panelist is welcome to start off if you want. Does anyone
I'm happy to jump in. Would you like me to?
Sure, go ahead.
Well, I think clearly the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions has been, you know, instrumental in moving the conversation on Palestine forward. You know, to a lot of people, it came naturally, because obviously, why would you want to support? Why would you not demand sanctions? Why would you not boycott, you know, a racist, violent state? And so clearly, it has moved things forward in ways that, in many, many ways. I think that the demands of the call for BDS make it very, very clear that ending the occupation, achieving civil rights or equal rights, and allowing the refugees to return means transforming the apartheid state into a free democratic Palestine, because these things will never happen in the current situation. I mean, the apartheid state of Israel will never allow any of those things to happen. So even maybe if it's not written down anywhere, clearly I think that's the direction this is going. And it's not, you know, I don't think it's you know, it's about a particular organization or a particular, I don't know if I would call it a movement, but the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, I think, is needs to be the banner behind which all of us who don't reside in Palestine, and some of the ones who do, but, you know, calling for people from the outside, this is the banner. This is what we need to be talking about. We need to maybe specify what this means. We need to maybe specify what kind of sanctions we're talking about and how severe they need to be. I would also agree that dialogue has become an industry. Maybe at one point the dialogue, I began my work through dialogue. So people say to me, well, you wouldn't have been where you are had you not, had there not been dialogue. At the same time, I think it's important that today people realize that the dialogue has become an industry and a tool to pull people in to this endless, useless, pointless process, at the end of which they hope everybody will agree with the Zionists and allow the Zionists to continue doing what they're doing. So I definitely tell people that normalization is absolutely unacceptable. Any kind of normalization. That would be my contribution to this.
Thank you so much. Did Dana or Ilan want to say anything else about that, about the role of the BDS movement?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, as my kid smacked his head as soon as that question was asked?
That's okay. We had a few questions regarding the BDS movement. One asked about, and I think Ilan mentioned this earlier, that it's hard to find people that still support a two-state solution in the movement, but the BDS hasn't officially endorsed one state for a variety of reasons. And I guess, do you see that as a precondition? And also you made questions asking about, and Miko just addressed his opinion on the role of normalization versus dialogue. And is it important that we have dialogue with Israelis if we really want to kind of increase support for a one-state solution?
Yeah, so I think the fact that BDS hasn't taken a position is a strategic one. Obviously, maybe this has already been said, but it's also like a testament to the fact that BDS is important, and getting people on board and understanding the Palestinian movement, or not movement, Palestinian struggle is important. But it is at the end of the day kind of tangential, in the sense that this is something that is being called for outside of Israel-Palestine, and within Palestine, different issues are at work, and within the region, different issues are at work. And I think BDS within the region has been a little bit problematic. It has been much more focused on kind of Western countries, has ceded the ground in the region to some degree, and has made as an organization, so like BDSmovement.net or whoever holds their social media campaign, on Twitter and stuff like that, have made some errors that have been problematic for certain activists in the region itself. But all of this speaks to the fact that there isn't a political movement that is more comprehensive, which is why we're falling back and having to use something like these calls for civil society mobilization, things like BDS, because we don't have something larger that we're calling for. We don't need BDS to be the thing that calls for that larger political program. We need a larger political program. And something that I kind of forgot to mention in my presentation is that's one of the remaining problems, is that Palestinians are very fractionalized, and we don't have a political program that we're putting forward that can be kind of cohesive and unified. And on the topic of normalization, obviously, I think that those dialogue campaigns, like Seeds for Peace, things like that, have been obviously problematic. They waste a lot of energy. But I think also people sometimes don't understand what normalization means. And they use it as kind of like a cudgel, to accuse people of some sort of treason to the movement or something like that. And I think that's really problematic and bad strategy as well, not only immoral, but bad strategy. Normalization does not mean, talking with American Jews, for example. Normalize, even those who might say, well, I'm a cultural Zionist, or okay, I'm not with a kind of a state program, but I have these affinities to the region or whatever. That's not what normalization means. And I think that, if I'm going to be honest, that parts of the kind of pro-Palestine milieu of activism or of groups has become kind of stultified. They're thinking about this very rigidly, and that's not how we should be thinking about it. obviously don't be co-opted by Zionist organizations. Don't waste your time talking or like trying to make Zionists feel better or like change their opinions. But that doesn't mean somebody like something like the iftar at Sheikh Jarrah that was viciously attacked online should be viciously attacked as normalization. That's not normalization to have an iftar with Jewish activists in Sheikh Jarrah. And anyway, I have a lot of thoughts and feelings about this. We can continue talking, but I think that we just need to be a little bit more nuanced. And we continue to add to our fractionalization when we go after each other. And I don't think that's what normalization means. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I guess this kind of relates to an issue that came up, and I know Miko mentioned this. In the US, as you all know, we have, there's a strong, pro-Israel lobby that, one question related to asking about, how to overcome the influence, and especially, there's a lot of Christian Zionists in this country, and they have a lot of influence in the way the US supports Israel. But there's also, Miko mentioned the local level too, and a lot of times that gets overlooked. I know RPIP has been involved here multiple times. Bills have come up in Virginia to anti-BDS laws, for example, that RPIP has kind of fought against and so far succeeded in preventing the enactment of anti-BDS laws here in the state of Virginia. But we do have those in over, dozens of states in the United States. So I guess if anyone wanted to say more about what you see as the way to sort of fight back against, Zionist lobbying, both at the federal level in the US and also at the local level. I know this is also a problem in some European countries too, though. And I don't know if Dr. Pappé wanted to start, since he hasn't said anything in the Q&A yet, but anyone else is welcome to talk on this issue too.
Yes, thank you. I think it's an important question. I think one of the things we should consider for the future is not to single out the Palestine issue in this conversation, as if this is the only violation of human rights and civil rights that the American political system is not only responsible for, but enhances. There's a direct connection between fighting against the ongoing discrimination and racism towards African Americans and the Israeli continued racism towards the Palestinians. If you disassociate this conversation, you are not at all, I think, relating to the intersectional reality on both sides, namely that Israel can not do what it does to the Palestinians without American support, and that the American support is partly the work of the lobby, of course, but it has to do with the worldview of America, of the world. Israel fits very well to the American establishment view of who is modern, who is not modern, who is on our side, who is not on our side. And I think, therefore, the forces that are struggling and challenging this both domestic and foreign immoral policies of the United States have no problem in seeing the struggle for Palestine as epitomizing other struggles. We have to do this because we have to remember the imbalance on the ground. The imbalance on the ground is such that you're not just galvanizing support for the Palestinians in the civil society, you are making sure that because of the genealogy of the question of Palestine, namely that it was first a Christian project before it was even a Jewish project, that it is connected to anti-Semitism, that is connected to Islamophobia, it's connected to racism. At the heart of the Western support for Israel is racism, Islamophobia, and surprisingly, maybe also a very deep anti-Semitism. These are the three impulses that build the Western support for Israel. And the struggle against racism in a place like America should be obvious, of course, but I tend to see it usually kind of as if these are two parallel struggles. And I think that more could be done without being too didactic about the country I don't live in and hardly visit. But from what I can see from afar is that this is still not coming out. And we were so excited that Black Lives Matters was how somehow associated with Palestine and so on. This should not be such a surprise and such an exceptional development. This should be the bread and butter of the struggle for Palestine in the United States. I think it's very dangerous to claim that in the case of Israel, the American immorality is worse than the destruction of Vietnam or Iraq, for that matter. There is a huge problem with the American role in the world, and Israel epitomizes this problem. And there's a huge problem in the way America still deals with racism, and the attitude to the Palestinians or supporting the racism against the Palestinian is part of it. Somehow, in my reading of the history, and I'm writing a book about it now, called Lobbying for Zionism on Both Sides of the Atlantic, I didn't see this in the counter forces that were trying to challenge lobbying for Zionism. It was always confined into the field that Zionists wanted us to play. It's about Jews and how the Jews treat the Palestinians. It's not a more global human problem, but it is. It's a problem that should bother every human being, especially every American citizen.
Thank you so much. And I saw Dana had her hand up too. Did you want to say something on this too?
Just a quick, addition to what Dr. Pappé was talking about. Not only is Israel not necessarily the worst manifestation or the only manifestation, but we also need to talk about kind of Israel's growing role as a node of authoritarianism in the world and particularly in the region. Because I think that those who talk in the way that Dr. Pappé would want us to talk about more, those who connect Palestine to Black Lives Matter or try to talk about intersectionality, they often miss regional issues, and because of that delegitimize themselves. So you'll have the person who's talking about Palestine and Black Lives Matter, or advocates in the West who talk about Palestine and Cuba or whatever, but they will take very, very poor and, sorry, that was my kid, frankly, disgusting positions on things like Syria. You do that, you delegitimize yourself. You're weaponizing, or you're not weaponizing, you're, what's the word? You're very strategically using the term intersectionality or or trying to connect Palestine to intersectional issues, but the moral underpinnings of that is missing. And so I think that also, not just Israel's role vis-a-vis American hegemony, but it's not just American hegemony that's at play here in the world, Israel's role in other things as well. I think that's also missing sometimes from the discussion.
Thanks. And I think Miko wanted to say something else too. Go ahead, Miko.
Just a sentence or two. The Zionists, the different Zionist groups, the different Zionist organizations in the US particularly, but not only, they already foresaw this. That's why we have, this push to accept this new definition of anti-Semitism. This is why, activists in the, Black Lives Matter or African-American activists in general, who showed us that there's a connection between the two struggles, have been labeled anti-Semitic. They're ahead of this. They, because, and I think it's important for people to understand, for all of us to appreciate the fact that the Zionists know, and the Zionist organizations, I think, are far bigger than just the state of Israel. They know that for them, this has to be a zero-sum game. They can't allow for any cracks in the wall. So they are ahead of us. And that's why, they're pushing, they push this whole, the Abrahamic Accord to show how wonderful Israel is accepted in the region and how Israel supports, and Israelis are now vacationing in Abu Dhabi or whatever. This is a campaign that's ongoing and moving forward very fast. And I think our problem is that we're just catching up. We're always one step behind, which is why I talked about the, dealing with elected officials, making sure they understand why they need to disassociate themselves from Zionism altogether. Because they're already there campaigning and pushing their agenda before we even get there.
All right, thank you all so much. We have time for maybe another question or two. One question that came up a few times, including at some of the previous panels, but was the issue, and I think Dana talked about this too, the problem of the lack of Palestinian unity, and that being, you know, kind of a precondition since this should be led by Palestinians. What do you all feel about strategies to, you know, kind of improve, you know, Palestinians' unity on some of these issues to help kind of move forward some type of program in the direction of one democratic state?
I'm happy to jump in. I don't think that's necessarily a true assessment of the reality. I think the uprising of last year's May, demonstrated that there is Palestinian unity. And I just got back from Palestine, and you know, activists everywhere in the Naqab, in Jerusalem, in Ramallah, in Lid, anywhere you go, in Nasra. There's not a single person I know that does not agree that a single democratic Palestine from the river to the sea is the objective. You know, I don't know anybody. And even Palestinians who are not activists, you know, this is the name of the game. Politically, there are factions, but I don't think that's a bad thing. On top of that, to try to get an activist from, I don't know, Bethlehem to connect and work with an activist from Lid is practically impossible, because where do they meet? And if they do find a place to meet, 5 minutes after they set the appointment to meet, either the PA intelligence services or the Israeli secret police will arrest one of them. So Palestinians face, I think, a very difficult challenge to do what we're expecting them to do, which is to come up with some kind of a united movement and united front. But I think in terms of the objective, there's, as far as I can see, at least in my experiences, there's absolute unity. In terms of the fact that there are factions, I think from a democratic perspective, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It doesn't have to be a figurehead. The Israeli prisons are filled with figureheads, and sadly, Palestinian cemeteries are filled with figureheads. And so once, again, we reach the point where we have a legislative body in a state that is free and democratic, and elections are being held, are called for, one person will vote elections, and all these prisoners and all these leaders are let out of prison, and people are allowed to travel, and Palestinians are allowed to engage in politics legally, then we will see, I think, the strength of the Palestinian political world, or political life, which is now, of course, silenced.
Great, thanks. And Dana, did you have something you wanted to say too?
I'm sorry, I haven't been able to fully hear what everybody's been
the
saying.
question was about Palestinian unity, and to one extent, and I know some people in the questions had also mentioned the recent Unity Intifada, which Miko referenced, but you know, in some of our other panels talking about some people seeing a problem of Palestinians being politically not unified, being an obstacle.
Oh, I see. Now I understand. Yeah, Miko's. Okay, buddy. Thank you. So I would just say, I don't think I disagree. I think that it's fine to have factions. I think the problem right now is that a lot of energy is wasted on the remnants of the PLO, whether it's the PA or whatever, and a lot of energy is wasted on kind of formal institutions. I think there is a unity in objectives. There's nothing wrong with having different factions, but the problem right now is that all of the organized groups are not actually in agreement about those objectives. Every activist group that were involved with the Unity Intifada, buddy, you're gonna fall. Please sit down. Sorry. I'm so sorry. I might have to end early. Those involved with the Unity Intifada spoke about how, well, we're engaging in short-term tactics. We're not engaging in long-term strategy. So I think, you know, in vague terms, there's a unity of objectives, but there isn't a strategic movement that isn't unified in any way. So, sorry. Yeah.
No problem. Thanks so much. And go ahead, Dr. Pappé.
Yeah, unfortunately, my children are too old to disturb. I would have loved them to disturb me every now and then. I think that we should be aware and not idealize a certain reality. The present political structures that claim, rightly or wrongly, to represent the Palestinians, whether these are the Palestinians members in the Israeli Knesset whether it's the PA, whether it's the Hamas. First of all, they're still subscribed to the two-state solution. We should be aware of that. Secondly, they are disunited. They are struggling for the very, very limited power that any representative body of the Palestinians can have in the present reality. I do think that part of the conversation of how to get to a one-state solution is a realization, which is very natural for all historical processes, that the existing political structures that were built in a certain historical moment and were meant to serve a certain stage in the liberation movement may not be useful in the 21st century. So the big project that we are part of, I think all of us, is also redefining the liberation project of Palestine in the 21st question. In fact, many of the questions we raised are at it. Some people are worried that if you say you want you're asking for redefinition of liberation struggle as if you don't believe in the liberation because of it. No, I just believe that, as Dana rightly said, that the settler project is not static. Also, liberation movements should not be static. If indeed the settler, and Dana Al-Kurd is absolutely right, the settler colonial reality keeps changing, the way they interact with each other. Look what happened to the Arab Jews over the years and so on. The liberation project has to take into account these things, and I'm afraid the present political structures are unable to deal with these challenges. Luckily, the Palestinian society is one of the youngest in the world, and they will be the ones who will define that liberation movement, but there's nothing wrong in telling them, learn from the past. This unity was one of the disabling features of Palestinian politics. It was not the reason of the Nakba. The reason of the Nakba was Zionist brutality with global support. That's why it succeeded. You know, self-criticism, rebuilding much more representative bodies, seeking a united vision beyond what Miko said, something a bit more concrete and political, is something Palestinians demand from themselves. I don't have to ask them to do this. And I think this will be a very important part of the discussion towards one state, especially on the ground, and the relationship between on the ground and other Palestinian communities. And this will be a Palestinian affair. And I predict that the Palestinians, the 48 Arabs, for the first time in the history of the Palestinian national movement since 1948, would play a far more central role in this than they ever played before, for various reasons that deserve a different webinar next week. So I won't go into that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And did you have something else you wanted to say on this, Miko? I wasn't sure if your hand was up from before.
Yeah, just really quickly. I mean, I agree with what's been said here. I think it's interesting that the demand is always placed on Palestinians. Why is there no Palestinian unity? Why are they factionalized? You know, where is the Palestinian Mandela? There's a Palestinian friend of mine said to me the other day, you know, my Nelson Mandela was assassinated. I think what worries me is Israeli unity and total support, or almost total support, for these just horrific crimes that the state of Israel is committing. My question is, you know, where is the Ruth First and Joe Slovo of on the Israeli side? Where are the people who are uniting and fighting, you know, actively, strongly, politically, trying to stop this apartheid war machine? So I think it's in this conversation very often, and I don't think this was intent here, but I think very often these questions are asked as though to say that, well, the Palestinians are so disorganized and they're so dysfunctional, and this is all their fault. Well, why are Israelis so united behind these crimes? You know, where are the Israeli voices calling for? And there are a few, of course. You know, we probably know all of them. You know, between us, there are some, but they're very, very few. So I would tend to ask the question in reverse. Although all the things that have been brought up are you know, I agree with.
And I guess a final question to kind of draw from that is, and some of the other questions that have been asked relate to this too. How do you all see, you know, I know you said, I think it was maybe Ilan said earlier, it's not a precondition for Israelis to support this, but do you see a way to either increase Israeli Jewish support for this idea, or someone else had asked a question about kind of delinking the identification, and I think, you know, some of you all brought this up too, of Israelis with Zionism. I know, you know, polls show that, you know, younger Israelis are even more right-wing than older generations, which, you know, is kind of discouraging. But do you see any practical strategies for kind of getting Israeli Jews to be more open-minded to a change in the status quo?
You know, things are not necessarily always interlinked. In other words, it is very important to invest in dialogue with Israeli Jews and try to convince them to accept the need of decolonization, to accept their a better understanding of what is the ideological movement that created the state of Israel and so on. I mean, all the things we are talking about can be said in Hebrew as well. And I'm, over the years, I'm still engaged in trying to talk to Israeli Jews about these issues without painting a rosy picture. I always tell them that decolonization is a very ugly process, and especially ugly for the colonizer, because they have to give up privileges and a lot of things. So I never beautify the process, but I never give up on the effort. I mean, I would not link this effort to the question, how far does Ilan and his friends have to go in telling us how many people they have deprogrammed before we can move on with a decolonization? While all the other efforts of decolonization include, and here I a little bit disagree with Miko, I think that everybody is entitled also to say to the Palestinians, have some self-criticism on the way that leadership is working, so on. This is not connected to defending Israel. But never mind. I think that while it's almost like a distribution of labor that is not connected, there is one historical lesson that we know, and I think that's why it's important to try and invest. I'm not sure it will succeed, but it's important to invest in a dialogue with Israelis, this tough, very tough dialogue with Israelis, because the more there is a willingness in a colonizer's society to change, the less violent the decolonization is. And we know from the rest of the world, societies that had to liberate themselves violently are missing something in the post-colonial period. There's something in the way you are born that affects you in the future. So it's a worthy project, not surely a successful one, but once there's up to people like us. It's not for Dana to do this, it's for me to do this. And this is part of our role. And you know, you have to be aware of your contributions. It's so important. I learned it as a so-called new historian. I think the major difference between me and the other Israeli historians who revised Israel's history, I always understood that my role is to help to legitimize the Palestinian narrative. I didn't like the fact that I was needed to legitimize it, but I helped to legitimize it. There's nobody can question that role. So I think that this is very important, a very good understanding of what you can do in this struggle and who you are in this struggle. And therefore, I think I wouldn't give up on this, you know. And maybe we are lucky, you know, you visit South Africa, every white person tells you I was against apartheid. And then you ask if you all were against apartheid, why it took so many years to undo it. But I think this is where one has to have the right, proper, proportional kind of view, contextualized view on the efforts versus Israel. So I don't think it's even a question of normalization and so on. It is a duty to try also to decolonize the mindset of the colonizer, not just the colonized. I think Frantz Fanon is still one of the best books ever written on decolonization, and one has to reread it again and again because he was so comprehensive in viewing a decolonization process from all the possible angles. And he knew exactly that the decolonization is also in the minds of people and not just physically on the ground.
We're going to go ahead and wrap things up. So, of course, first of all, I wanted to give a huge thanks to all our panelists for being here today, and also to all our attendees. Thank you so much for attending. I wanted to remind you all that we will make recordings available at some point after this conference ends, and those who are registered will receive some links and more information. We plan to also get some summaries from the panelists to provide some kind of digital info to go with the recording. So keep a lookout for that. So thanks again to everyone. I'm going to turn it over to Adib Abed to just kind of wrap it up today. And I wish you all luck. Take care.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you to our panelists and to the attendees. And just a couple of thoughts before I go down the list of all those people that worked on this conference. Our goals for this conference was recognized, rightfully so, by Jeff Halper yesterday, because he said it's the first of its kind, and it's to change the discourse around peace building for Israel-Palestine. We hope to create a greater momentum around the one-state solution movement and how to get there. We believe, and after 2 days of listening to such as scholars, that yes, it has to be Palestinian-led, but also that does not prevent us from doing our part. And I think the Palestinian challenge for this particular juncture in the Palestinian struggle has to be the total rejection of the Oslo Agreement and all of its manifestations, including the PA and all of its apparatuses and all of the security forces. And it's an oppressive regime that is a subcontractor for the Zionist colonizers. And for us, we have to, and I'm going to quote my friend Miko, the Zionists, the Israeli colonizers of Palestine are not going to just one day see the light. They have to be hit beside the head with a 2x4. And the 2x4 is BDS. Colonizing and the apartheid state has to become unsustainable. It has to become costly. Israel right now is not paying a cost. We can get all the resolutions and all the conferences we want. As long as the money keeps flowing, they're okay. Only last week, they declared that they are taking over 20,000 dunams in the Jordan Valley and additional 3,000 housing units. And prior to that, 4,000 housing units. All of that in the Palestinian so-called territories. But they're happy with the way things are. It has to become costly. And the only way it can become costly is for all of our allies and friends to work on local politicians. And you cannot be anti-racist and pro-Israel and pro-Zion and anti-Palestinian. To all of this is the litmus test that we have to put all politicians to. And we should not be shy from discussing it along with all of the other issues. Yes, we should be involved in other local issues and national issues, but also connecting it with the Palestinian issue. You can't be for Black Lives Matter in the US, but you're a strong supporter of Israeli apartheid in Palestine. We need to call them out on that. And I don't want to go on. We can go on for another day and another time. But I really want to thank all of those who have worked on this panel, all of our attendees, and we look forward to working with you in the future. Before I mention anyone, I want to start by mentioning those who have worked behind the scene, mainly James Metz, who has been our technical guru that worked out all the glitches on this webinar. Thank you, Jim. Without you, it could not have happened. Also, in the background, we have Marty Ween that worked with me on this idea ever since it was just an idea a year ago. And we put it together, and he was there every single day. Anjam Ali, Robin Allman, Jennifer Hitchcock, Reem Khaldi, all of you. Without you, it couldn't have been done. Some of you wear a couple of hats, that is of moderator and the screener and. I want to thank all of you. It could not have happened without you. And last but not least, I would like also to thank all of our co-sponsors, the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, American Friends Services Committee, Appalachian Peace Education Center, Arab American Association of Central Virginia, Episcopal Peace Fellowship, the National Capital Regional Chapter, Friends of Sabil, North America, Jewish Voice for Peace, DC Metro, National Arab American Women's Association, Palestinian Christian Alliance for Peace, Virginia Coalition for Human Rights, Voices from the Holy Land. And I'll be amiss if I didn't thank Shireen Abu Akleh for all what she has done, for her memories, for her work. She would always be with us, and this conference is in her honor, and the work we will be doing is to keep her memory alive and to end the system that targeted her and murdered her. And for all peace-loving people, thank you so much, and we look forward to staying in touch and working together in future events. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day. Palestine will be free. Thank you.